So I'll just kind of start out by telling you guys how I ended up in a garden. I am a self-identifying Black thumb. I do not grow plants very well. They don't like me. Um, it's just not my forte, but I love plants and I love the outdoors. And when I moved to Austin, we joined the Wildflower Center as members. And as members, I really enjoyed being able to go out there, walk around with the kids, and see the plants. But also at that time, they had an art program going on. And that was run by Mr. Joe Hammer, who is an Austin artist. And he kind of was the person who engaged the art that came in. So worked with artists to create different shows. And I had remembered that. And when I initially applied for a position at the Gardens, I was really excited because that was what I thought about it, only to find out that the art program had kind of been dismantled a bit when Joe retired. And so that, that kind of bummed me out, but I also saw it as an opportunity to maybe be able to bring art back into the Texas State Botanical Garden, which is the Wildflower Center. So just have been kind of over the last 3 years looking at opportunities to increase the presence of art in our garden. My background is in art history, and always kind of imagine myself more in a traditional art museum. But I really enjoy challenges. And so I kind of took this on as a challenge. And I enjoy working there so much. There's fantastic people. And it's really interesting that as you start talking to the horticulturists, as you're, discussing garden layouts and design, and you're working with landscape architects, you start to realize it's a lot of the same language. They're talking about color, line, texture, space, all the things that artists speak about. And so, I think the first step for me was kind of recognizing that that art and garden have this really big intersection where they meet. And and that's true throughout the history of art, right? So we have examples of art being represented in history. We have examples of of the artist going into the garden and finding examples of things that they want to portray. And sometimes that was used in a funeral way, sometimes it was used in a celebration way, as examples of power and things like that. So art got used in many different ways within garden settings over the last 4,000 years. I just want to check in and see, Coco, did you get my
yes, setting up?
Okay, awesome. Yeah, it has a lot of images, so it takes a minute to download. So we have art going back about 4,000 years in gardens. And so this is kind of, I'm just giving you like a couple of areas in a timeline where art was represented in gardens. So this is actually one of the Assyrian palaces going back to Mesopotamia from about 600 BCE. And so one of the things I found out in kind of researching art and gardens is that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon that I grew up, with Nebuchadnezzar and understanding, that actually was not true, or there's been no proof of that. But they really think it was in Nineveh that these gardens existed. So it was under the Assyrian kings rather than Babylonian kings, but it's in that same area of Mesopotamia that's kind of right there between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and often considered the civilization, kind of the cradle of civilization. So we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to show an example of how artists, um, replicated the gardens that they're seeing. And so this is in a low relief style into gypsum. It's from Nineveh. And so they would, carve into the stone, and then these reliefs would actually be displayed around the palaces. And so this was really a show of power. This was a show of engineering because they were able to water these lush gardens in this kind of very arid region with aqueducts, water from aqueducts that they had built. And so, that's pretty amazing to me. And so obviously they were very proud of that. And kind of remember, this space, it was this beautiful garden with orchards. And the king would use it as his personal space. So there is that kind of point of privacy. And I think that that's something that we see in gardens quite a bit. There are different types of gardens. And botanic gardens would typically kind of fall under pleasure gardens as opposed to like fruit gardens or orchards and things like that. But obviously this is really important for an artist to take the time to create something like this, install it within the palaces and show that. So we can go to the next slide. We're going to take a big jump leap here over to Egypt. So it's interesting to me because when you study art history, you see a very similar kind of movement, right? So you see art move from Mesopotamia over to Egypt and kind of evolve. And certainly this is a singular timeline that I'm presenting. There are many different timelines to look at. So keep that in mind. This is only a few examples. But in Egypt, they also really embraced the idea of the gardens. They were so important that you would see frescoes like this in tombs. So, taking it with them into the afterlife. And so, it's just kind of, it keeps coming back around to the importance of that representation of the garden being there. In the next one. Okay, so we're jumping again over to Rome, and this is Augustus of Prima Porta, which comes in around 20 BCE. I really like this because I think, typically when we think of Roman sculpture, we think of this white marble that you see on the left. And these were created, definitely propaganda art, right? He's reinforcing his right to rule. He's the first prince among men, the prince, the person who is in charge of religion, in charge of war. And he's always represented, Augustus is always represented at about this age, around 30 years old. And so at kind of his height of charm, I suppose. But interestingly, I always like to point out this little Cupid that's hanging on his hem. And this goes to his claim that he is descended from the gods, and specifically from the goddess Venus, as claimed by Julius Caesar, his uncle and adoptive father. And so on the right, we kind of see something that looks almost garish maybe to some of us, where it's painted marble rather than just the white marble, that time has worn off that paint. And in some cases, like with the Elgin marbles at the British Museum, a overzealous curator has worn off that paint. It's just kind of interesting to see this. So this actually was installed at the garden of Augustus's wife, Livia, at Prima Porta, one of her kind of country homes that had a beautiful garden. And so this was installed within the garden. And I think a lot of times when we think about garden sculpture, we think about this type of sculpture, this marble statue. In fact, if you type in garden sculptures, one of the first sites that comes up is Home Depot, which has a lovely selection of Roman and Greek garden sculptures to choose from. So I thought that was pretty interesting and a little funny. So next slide, please. So we're going to jump forward again into the Baroque era. So when I think Baroque, I think Versailles. And so, digging around in this a little bit and having some knowledge of it previously, Charles Le Brun, who was the first painter for the King Louis XIV, and was named that, I believe, in 1664. He's working at Versailles as the first painter. He's known for the paintings that he created that were turned into tapestries. He's really kind of a Baroque man or a Renaissance man. He's doing all of these different things. And so I wanted to just kind of give an idea of the scope of the gardens versus the chateau itself. So you can kind of see in the bottom right corner of that map there, that is the chateau, which is the house or the palace that Louis XIV built, kind of based on and built around a hunting lodge that was his father's in Versailles, which is about 11 miles outside of Paris. And so these lines that you see running, they're very important. And this is where I kind of go back to thinking about that intersection between what the horticulturist does, what the artist does, working with lines and what is the importance of the line and where it's placed. And they're creating these aisles, these lanes and avenues that all report back to Paris, essentially. So Versailles is in line with Paris, right? And we find out later that's maybe not the best idea when the French Revolution comes along. But that was the idea of Louis XIV, was I'm still connected. I am, at the center of this. And so those gardens just help reinforce those lines. So Le Brun was very, very important to the design of Versailles. And if you'll go to the next slide, we can see these statues that he actually designed. So he designed these sets of statues for the gardens of Versailles. So again, he's looking back to that Greek and Roman who borrowed from the Egyptians and even back to the Sumerians and Babylonians, that they're kind of all repeating each other. So we see this again and again and again. So it gets a little repetitive, and that's why I didn't go into like a huge amount of detail in kind of thinking about the art of the gardens in earlier times. Can you forward one slide, please? So, I wanted to kind of jump forward into a more modern era, but still, about 100 years ago, with Claude Monet. So Monet, I think when people think of depictions of gardens, Monet is the person that pops into their head a lot of times. I have always thought of Impressionist art as kind of gateway art. It is something that eases people to look at it, and you don't have to know about the gods and goddesses. You don't have to know about biblical stories. You don't have to know history or philosophy necessarily to appreciate Monet's panels. So in about the last 30 years of his life, he created something like 250 water lily panels. Some of these panels were installed in, I wrote down the date, May 16th, 1927, in the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris, which was built specifically for this exhibition. If you haven't had a chance to go, you should. It's beautiful. It's interesting because he created a space that's very similar to a garden in the fact that it's very meditative and quiet and contemplative. And in this, within these rooms that were built to really highlight the just expansiveness and monumentality of the panels. So highly recommend visiting there if you have the opportunity. But he's painting directly from his own gardens. So he creates this garden as a labor of love. And then he paints on the panels what he sees, how the light reacts, right, within his garden, as the Impressionists do. And he's direct painting onto these. He's figuring it out. There's many unfinished pieces that still are hung in museums because they're still fantastic. But he's capturing the color and the changes of the day in what's happening within that garden from season to season. And I think a lot of people, including myself, look at this and go, it's you don't have to have a great depth of knowledge of the garden or of any of the other things I've mentioned. However, a lot of people don't realize that Monet actually was very thoughtful about the environment. He actually lobbied against his, against his city council, who was planning to cut down trees along a river in Giverny. And so he painted these trees in order to kind of make them more important, right? And to show what they are and what they do in the way that he knew how to express that. And that was through his painting. And so he really did think about the environment as, in terms of early, 20th century artists would, right? So he's thinking about those things as he's painting outdoors. So again, we have artists going back to nature all the time for source material, and then also creating these environments that reflect what they want to paint, right, too. So it's kind of working in both ways. And then if we could go to the next slide. So I wanted to put one contemporary artist in here because I chose not to flood you guys with a bunch of images of art happening in gardens right now, because I don't want to influence someone's creative kind of thought process of what should be in a garden, because that's kind of what I want to talk to you about next. So Yo-Yo Kusama is a Japanese artist. She's kind of she's a hot commodity right now for sure. I've had the privilege to see several of her works. She does have work that is inside of the gallery, but then she also has these pieces that are installed in gardens. And this one's actually at New York Botanical Garden in New York City. And that show, I believe, just opened or is just about to open there. So it's really, interesting how she interprets it. And this all has to do with how she sees things. She sees things with dots in them, and that influences a lot of her work. She's known for the infinity rooms inside, and then also Narcissus Garden, which is mirror balls that are just scattered around in a space. And so she has a way of working that's very like you identify it immediately, right? Like that's Yo-Yo Kusama when you see it. And so it's but this is one artist working now who puts art in gardens. All right, so that's my super quick high level couple of examples of art and how gardens and art have worked together over thousands of years. And now let's kind of look at, if we'll go to the next slide, looking at your art being in the garden and some things that you might want to consider. So I'm going to preface this by saying that I receive several emails and phone calls from artists who tell me a little bit about their work usually, and ask if they could install an exhibition or an installation. And so I'm going to try and kind of give you a couple of things that you might want to think about before you send that email. And I don't think, I feel like as an artist, and I I always joke around. I took art classes, but my mom really likes my art, and that's about it. So I do not claim to be an artist myself. So I always feel like I want to leave as much space for the artist to be creative as possible when working with someone. If I have a specific goal in mind, I try and share that, but not what it looks like, not what it feels like, or sounds like. So I try to leave that space there for the artist to be able to create. And I think that that's really important for us to have meaningful work in gardens. So first of all, I would say do your research. If you are reaching out to a garden, there are many, many, many different types of gardens, as I mentioned before. And so do your research, find out what type of garden they are. So for example, the Wildflower Center, we're a botanical garden, but we're also an arboretum. And we focus on native plants. So all of our plant life that you find there would be native to our ecosystem or to our ecoregions. So do your research, find out, is there a gallery? Is there a program going on? All of those types of things. Do you have an art program? How does art work within what's already existing? So for me, a lot of times, if I have an artist reach out to me, or maybe I know an artist and I reach out to them, I can't necessarily create an entire installation for them or an entire exhibition for them. But what I can do is put you into something that is existing. And so that's where I kind of feel like I get to help facilitate a better experience for our guest, but also a better experience for the artist. And that's what my goal is usually. And then that lets us kind of build a relationship too. It lets you build a relationship with the people who come out, with the staff at the garden, and then bigger conversations can kind of happen from that. So make sure that you connect to that garden space. Make sure that you connect to that mission. Have something to say, right? Make sure that it's something that you feel your art can speak to. And so, does it make sense in that space? And I think it can make sense in a lot of ways. It doesn't have to be a flower. It doesn't have to be botanical. But how do you make it make sense? So if you're going to create something that's harmonizing with the garden, then maybe it does reflect what you see. But maybe you're creating something that kind of has like this juxtapose that creates a conversation, right? So recently there was an installation of it's a modeled piece of takeaway containers. I was trying to think of the right word, the takeaway containers. And so that artist is really kind of speaking to, our grab and go culture, our throwaway culture, in this garden space. So obviously conservation, sustainability, figure out like how do you have that speak to one another? And so sometimes you might want something that's a little jarring to see in a garden. So if you're walking through and you see a pile of refuse there, it's probably going to make you stop and consider, why is that there and what is it? And, and think about it. And so you can create some really great points in doing something like that. Something to always think about is, how can this be used through education, right? How can this reach a broader audience than the art lovers? And that's how you increase your audience, and that's also how we increase our audience. Because most gardens, I will say this, most gardens are working as nonprofits. And so, a lot of our revenue comes from getting people through the door, just like in an art museum, and through donations and through, getting people engaged. And so all of those things have to make sense to be able to install the work. right? It has to bring in people, it has to engage people, it has to create conversations for it to make sense for all of the effort that you put in and that we put in to make something like that happen. I would also say, do you have a goal in creating that work? What is your end goal? Is it to have it installed for 4 months? Is it to have it out for 1 day? Is it to have something happen for there to be a process to take place? Is your goal to be able to engage with certain grants maybe that you've applied for? Make all of that really clear when you're submitting your work for consideration. Because the more problems that you kind of solve before you write that email and you can just send it over, the easier it is going to be for me to say yes, right? And that's what you want at the end of the day. So, and I've kind of touched on this already. Do you bring something new to the conversation? So think about like how am I doing this that is going to bring something new into that space? So don't necessarily look at Yo-Yo Kusama and go, okay, I'm going to do something like that because she's really popular right now. Bring something new into that conversation. Look at what the garden has done in the past, and this is where it kind of goes back to doing your research. Look at what they've done in the past, and think about how you can do something that is going to make people really want to come out, see your work, see it again. If it's there over months, see it in different seasons. And that's something that we'll talk about on the next slide. So some things to really consider when you're making art for a garden. And I can tell you firsthand, weather conditions, whatever you think is going to be the worst weather possible, like times 3. Okay. So if you think, okay, it has to sustain 12 mile per hour winds, think like 40 mile per hour winds. If it's like, okay, it has to be okay in the rain, like think torrential downpour, worst weather conditions. That's what you have to plan for because it is brutal when you try to install art and don't have all of that kind of considered. So think about the weather conditions. So that's all the bad part about weather conditions. The great part about weather conditions, think about how your art will react in the light and in movement. All of those things can also be really beautiful. So, and can change the perception of what you created. And it's really cool to have people come back and see things at different times of the year, at different times of the day, and have them react to it in different ways. So you're able to do that with having art installed outside. Another thing to consider are what materials are you using? The materials that you use can be really important because I can tell you firsthand that if I am interested in bringing in an artist, one of the first questions I'm going to get is, what are they using to make that? And so you want to make it as eco-friendly, sustainable, reusable, have a in place for it. So if you're building something out of wood, what are you doing with that wood after you deinstall it? So you have to think through all of those things. Again, with the materials, going back to the weather, make sure that your materials can withstand the weather that you're going to be placing it in, right? And kind of anticipate changes to those materials and figure out, how do I keep it from changing, or how do I let it change, but do that in the way that you want it to, right? So if you install something that's metal and you intend for it to oxidize, like trying to kind of measure that through. So sustainability, again, just really important to this type of art of putting it into the garden. The sustainability issue is definitely not new. But when you think about like big earthworks, right? So like Robert Smithson and Spiral Jetty, and he's moving land out into this lake. So he's mastering the land, he's mastering nature, right? But he's also disturbing some ecosystem there. So are you doing something that's going to create an issue down the line potentially? And that's what you want to avoid. You don't want to have to go back and have remediation because of art that you installed for the land. And when you're outdoors, you do have wildlife to contend with, birds. At the Wildflower Center, we have spiders, snakes, coyotes, armadillos, all sorts of fun stuff. And so those are actually sometimes very inspiring, right? But they can also cause some issues with art. So kind of think through some of those things. Yes, deer too. Lots of deer. We actually had a buck deer in one of our installed forts in December. And so that was interesting, trying to navigate the deer back out to his area. So you have to consider all of those things though. Who would have thought, hanging up some bamboo pieces that clank together would call deer over, but apparently it does. So think about the sustainability of your work. Also think about, and I didn't put this in here, but think about the space. So especially if you're used to being in a gallery or in some space with 4 walls, all of a sudden space is a very different proposition, right? You no longer have this confining area. Now all of a sudden you have all the space you could need, but because of that space, you really need to consider your proportions and make sure that it works. Think about your scale of the piece and how it will work against a tree that's 40 feet tall, right? Or maybe in a grass that's 24 inches tall. So you have all of those different components to think through. The installation of the work. So unlike in a museum or an art gallery, a lot of times the installation is going to be largely on you with some collaboration with the garden. We do not necessarily typically have installers working at the garden. So that is a plan that you'll have to think through and work out with your contact in the garden and how you can best install your work and create the least amount of damage to any garden beds. I always kind of try to think of it, when you're walking through a gallery at a museum, you have your gallery attendants who are standing there and asking you to, be careful, don't touch the art, don't back up into the art when you're taking a selfie, all of those good things. And the same thing happens in a garden. It's the beds instead of the art on the wall, So just kind of always being really thoughtful of that's someone's work, and that's the primary reason for the garden to exist. So thinking about installation is really important. Also, maintenance is another big issue. So maintenance of work, be as specific as you can be. If it's something that needs to happen, every 2 weeks, this needs to be tightened. Every 2 weeks, this needs to be moved here, something like that. See if you can create a schedule, see if maybe it's something that you can help monitor, and so then that way, you don't come back in 2 months and your work of art is not representing who you are as an artist and what you created. So that maintenance part is really important. And when you're in an indoor space where you have temperature control, and you have kind of the emphasis is on the art, maybe it's not as big of an issue. And thinking about your message and how does your message tie back to the garden's mission? All right, so we have native plants, we conservation. At the Wildflower Center specifically, we have water cisterns where we collect water. We collect 100,000, I think it's 300,000 gallons of water a year or something like that, that then gets used for watering our plants. So, we're very proud of our aqueduct system. The architecture of the place, like the history of the place. So it doesn't have to be just the flower or just the plant. It can speak to many different things, but make sure that you're making that connection as clear as possible. Because more than likely, whomever you reach out to at a garden, including myself, I can't just go, oh yeah, go ahead and put that in. I have to go talk to other people that I work with the gardeners, and talk to them about what the possibility is. And the clearer I can express to them what the message of the art is and how it helps support who we are, where we are, the space that we're in, the land that we're on, that's going to help get the green light to go forward. So make sure that your message connects in some way. It doesn't have to connect because it's a plant. And in fact, I would say if it is a plant, they're even more kind of specific and maybe a little pickier, because they want to make sure it's representing the right type of plant and it's representing it correctly. But there are so many different ways that you can go about creating work for a garden, through selection of materials, through selection of color, through selection of the texture and techniques that you create. So think outside the box. We talked about marble, metal, obviously great for sculptures. So we've got sculptures, wood sculptures. Painting is a little bit different, because you're probably not going to bring a painted canvas out and install it unless you come up with some really cool way to be able to do that outdoors. In which case, please let me know. But we do have, for example, right now we have a mural on this large glass window that we have. And so that's in one of the gardens. So we do murals. So, some of those things you can definitely do, or install, painting on wood maybe, or something like that. So that's maybe how you install painting, but also think about fiber materials, so cloth. Our artist in residence program, Dawn Kim is the artist this year. The artist in residence program, I'll talk to you more about in just a minute, but she's actually doing cyanotypes on fabrics, and then those will be installed in one of the areas of our garden. So that's a completely different type of material, a different process that's usually kind of more identified with photography and exposure. But so she's doing that, and it's combining with quilting, and I think it's gonna be really cool. So I hope you guys come out and see that at the beginning of next week. That's being installed. So there's all of those different types of materials, and I'd say just kind of push yourself to think what's going to work outside, right? How can I create something different that can be installed? Lots of people are getting into like the handcraft kind of stuff with crochet, or knitting, those types of elements kind of in there. Photography, I myself am very I love works on paper, and I keep trying to figure out, like, how can I have works on paper in the garden spaces? Like, can we build a box of some sort to allow that? Some way to install it as if it's a gallery but outdoors. So I think that there's so much creativity out there, and it's how to push your art to be able to take it into outdoor spaces with thinking about these things, thinking about weather and the conditions that you're in. And to me, it's always a fun conversation to have with artists when they come out to the garden to help kind of envision what could happen. We've had sound installations, we've had several painted murals. And Coco, if you'll go to the next slide. Uh-oh, is it blink? Oh, no, there. Oh, wait. Okay, there we go. So to tell you a little bit about what's happening at the Wildflower Center that you might be interested in as an artist, we have Fortlandia. And so Fortlandia is an exhibition that happens from October through to the end of January. It's temporary. It is mission-based, and then it engages with many different areas of the creative community in Austin. So we have had several pieces or several forts, I should say, installed by artists, visual artists. We have had landscape architects, we've had design companies, architects, you know, just all sorts of different people. I think the one on the top right is actually like a lumber company. Yeah, so we have all different types of forts installed for this. 9 to 10 forts have been chosen in the past for the installation, and they have to stay in place that entire time. And so we've learned a lot about maintenance of these types of things. And as you can imagine, especially with something like this, you have kids engaging with this every day. But one of the things that we saw from this is a huge jump in the number of people coming out to the center during a time that was typically pretty slow. So that's something that we always have to think about. We have to think about you know, the revenue coming in through admissions, and you know, kind of creating more awareness for the Wildflower Center through these types of exhibitions and installations. This is a program that does have an RFP, and so you would submit for that. So if you're interested in any of these things, please feel free to shoot me an email, dhewitt@wildflower.org, and I'll connect you with the right person if it's not me, or get you the information that you need for it. So Fortlandia is just really, it's so fun seeing the kids out there playing, and it's also really fun seeing the adults out there taking their pictures. It's become quite the Instagrammable spot to hang out in the fall and winter. And next slide. And I want to show some of the close-ups of Fortlandia. We've got on the top left, this was the what was it? The greenhouse. So the letterpress play did for us, and was really cool. The kids loved walking around in there. It was almost like a house. I kept joking around that I was going to move in there when Fortlandia was over. But it was really fun to see the kids engage with it. And on the top right and lower left is A-frame fort, which was built by Pollen. And so you can kind of see it change colors on each side. It was also lit during our illuminations event, and so it actually changed colors because of the light, obviously, as well. So that was really fun, and it won the award for our visitors' favorite. So everyone voted on that, and you know, very happy for Pollen. They were great collaborators and partners on bringing this in for Fortlandia. And so that's out in our Texas Arboretum, which is, I believe, 20 acres and about a mile-long trail. And Coca, go to the next slide. This is a picture from Luminations. So Luminations, it started out when I first came on board at the Wildflower Center. It was 4 days, and then we went to 8 days, and then this year I think we did 34 days, 43 days, something like that. I'm blocking it out. I can't remember. It was over a month long though. And so we went out to the Arboretum, we lit some of the forts, so that was fun. And then we had other art installations. So you'll see kind of in the background, behind the fort to the left, 2 video screens. So we had 2 video installations out there each night. That was really interesting. We actually built our own watertight boxes to put the projectors into, and then installed screens. And there was a lot of wind during that time. So, you know, you live and you learn. So I definitely do recommend if you're installing something outdoors, maybe do a test run of it and see how it works, how it holds up. Because as time went by, we got better and better at it and kind of figuring it out and what we needed to do to give the guest the best experience and to give the viewer the best experience. So those had sound as well as projection. And then we had 2 other sound installations happen in Illuminations. One was a recording of the weather for the last 25 years, which is when this location of the Wildflower Center opened was 25 years ago. And so the artist took all of that data and translated it into sound. The other sound installation that we had was actually a symphony of plants. And so we attached these nodes that the artist sent us with this little machine that translated it into different sounds. So the energy coming from the plants actually gave the signals to create the sounds that the viewers heard. And once everyone like read the piece about it and figured out, oh, that's what's happening, people were just like, oh, that's so cool, that's amazing, you know. And so that was really fun to see people explore something completely different than they'd ever seen before, you know, or heard before for that matter. So yes, Alicia, it was super awesome. It was really fun. It was like one of the things that I enjoyed going around and listening to each night. And so, you know, this year I want to change it just a little bit and probably have more light installation. So working with artists, especially in a space like this, if you have the skill to include light in what you do and what you make, that's going to be a benefit because it is very dark out at the Wildflower Center when the sun goes down. So I'm always kind of looking for interesting ways to incorporate light into spaces or install something that is light-based for our guest. So that's another thing to kind of consider. So with Illuminations, this year it's going to run from December 1st through January 1st, or maybe December 3rd through January 31st, I think. So it's going to be 2 months long. We saw about 16,000 people come out for Illuminations last year. I believe we had something like 80,000 people come out for Fortlandia. We received, just to kind of give you an idea of what that reflects for us annually, we have about 200,000 visitors annually at the Wildflower Center. And that number has risen since Fortlandia started, since Illuminations has kicked up. Yeah, so obviously people want to see things installed in the garden. They want to have a reason to go. And we always kind of call wildflower season in the spring. It's one of the exhibitions. It's just one that the gardeners have that one. They get to control that one completely. But it is the show when you come out in March and April and May. So I think that's it for my slides. I think Coca.
Yes.
So, but I'm happy to answer questions. If you have questions about something that you're making or, you know, putting art in the garden or want an opinion, happy to answer. I think, is it best if they do it in the Q&A or the chat?
However you want. You can, I'll monitor both.
Okay,
we have one in Q&A. Jamie, hi Jamie. Is there going to be an open call for Illuminations?
Yes, Jamie. And you know, I love your art, Jamie. So Jamie's an amazing artist. She creates these fantastic aluminum sculptures. I hope I'm representing that properly, as well as jewelry, and it's beautiful. Yes, we will have an RFP for Illuminations. just like Fortlandia does. And then also thank you, because we had talked about this, Jamie, it reminded me, some of the things I'm working on for the garden are a sculpture program that would be an annual sculpture program. So that is in the works. I don't have that fully together yet, but just kind of something to think about. And then, like I said, we have our artist in residence program, which is for people coming out of their MFA. So the year after they graduate is when they are able to apply. And then it is in collaboration with the College of Fine Arts at UT. And it's a great program. So if you know someone getting their MFA, definitely pass it along to them. That information is on the College of Fine Arts website. It's called the St. Elmo Artist in Residence program.
Thank you. Shalina is asking, are there any opportunities in interior spaces?
So that's a really great question. And that was kind of why I said, do your research, see if there's a gallery. So when Joe was there, as I mentioned early on in this conversation, when Joe was there was a gallery space. Unfortunately, that space is not really suitable right now for that purpose. But if you know someone who has $2 million, we would love to refurbish it and make it into a beautiful gallery again. So that's all.
Alicia,
you never know.
Yeah. Alicia Feely is asking, hey Alicia, when we reach out to submit an idea that's not tied to Illuminations or Fortlandia, do we need to have our own funding?
So having your own funding is really helpful and useful. I'll give you an example of that. Steve Parker came to us actually about right after I started at the Wildflower Center, and he had an NEA grant to work with us specifically. And so through Collide Art. And so we have been working within that grant for the last 2 years. He brought that to us, and it makes it very easy, because then it makes it so that I don't have to figure out whose budget, what funding is coming through, because I do believe in artists getting paid. I always want the artist to get paid. And if that's through a grant that you put together, that's even better, even easier for me to say yes. Is it necessary? No. So some examples of that would kind of fit into that area that I was talking about, where I try to use something that I already have set up. So like right now we have a series called Tuesday Twilights happening, which really is about live music, coming out, hanging out, walking around the gardens. It's really lovely. But there's an art component to it. So for example, this last week, we had the artist who created the mural on the MLC window. We had him come out, and he brought out some of his prints to show people that he does. And we took Polaroids of people in front of the mural, and just got him to kind of talk about it and look at it. And the reason that we painted that specific, or that I said, hey, can you do something with sunflowers, is because the sunflowers are wildflower of the year. And so it's just to kind of help promote that fact. So we did that. I have an artist coming out who does event painting, and so she's coming out to paint our theme gardens during Tuesday Twilights. I had an idea and had kind of started talking to someone about this, about doing something with the colors of the wildflowers, and kind of doing something with color theory to have people interact with and engage with. So there are things like that I can do pretty easily. If you're talking about a full-blown installation, depending on how much it costs, it would probably be at least 1 to 2 years out before I could fund it, and it would have to fit into that timeline. And I would have to be able to say, this is going to help us increase visitorship in this way, if that makes sense, or find our own funding. Yeah.
So such a good question, and it's great to know that there are options. And yeah, like just NEA. What other funding have you partnered with?
The Austin Creative, is it Austin Creative? I also work with Texas Commission for the Arts. I'm able to get grants with them, so I'm set up to work with them. So if you're part of that system, that makes it a little bit easier. So those are the ones that I've worked with before, but I know that there are many other pieces out there. And if it's an idea and you bring it to me and it's something I can figure out, educational component to it, working with our director of programs, or maybe there's a donor that might be interested in doing something and I know that, and I can help pull all that together, you know. So I would say something sometimes I see is that there's like an immediacy to it. It's like, hey, I want to put up this artwork and they want it to happen. The artist wants it to happen in the next 3 months or 4 months, you know, and I totally get that because I'm a little bit that way too. Like, I'm going to make it happen. But I would say have a little bit of patience, and just try to understand that there's a lot of pieces that have to pull together to make it happen in a setting like a garden, because you have 60 employees working there, and it's kind of where you're having to ask, especially if it's going to be in the garden, you have to work with a horticulturist, you have to find the funding, you have to get approval, you know, all of those fun things.
Awesome, thank you. Then Erin asks, do you have a permanent collection of art at the center?
That's a great question. We have some really nice works of art at the center. We are currently going through a process of becoming a recognized museum, not an art museum, but a living museum, but we would have a non-living collections within that. If you know anyone who wants to work on documenting collections, let me know. I am just shilling for everything, Coca. But we have art, we have objects, in some really beautiful, nice things that we need to create that and formalize that collection. Yeah, but we have like a Norman Rockwell painting of Mrs. Johnson, and several other works that are just really tremendous.
Thank you. And then Dottie, she's a gardener with native plants and an artist. She's an experienced museum and community educator and wants to talk about developing programs to do classes to engage the public in your space. Who would be the good person to talk to about a proposal like that?
Yeah. So I do not do education at the garden. That is Tanya Zastro. She and I work together quite a bit, as you can imagine. We kind of overlap with me being events, exhibitions, and her in community partnerships, and her being programs and education. We kind of luckily get along really well, and she's amazing to work with. And so we work together quite a bit. But I would reach out to her if you have a specific class idea. And she's tzastro at wildflower.org.
Thank you. We have another question from Alicia. So you'd be open to helping direct an artist towards a grant?
Yes. So if oh, thank you, Leslie. Leslie posted Tanya's. Would you mind putting mine in there too, Leslie? I can't do it right now. But yeah, especially, so Alicia, I know very well and have known for several years, and have a huge amount of respect for you and your work. So I feel like that would be something I would be happy to kind of meet with you one-on-one with. I can't do that all the time for everyone, because I have many hats. And if you've worked in nonprofit before, you probably know you usually, and Coca can attest to this as well, you usually do many different things. But yeah, I mean, I think keeping an eye open for grants that speak to ecology, that speak to to garden spaces, that would be a very specific kind of place there.
Thank you. And then Shalina asks, I work with Texas mountain laurel seeds, arranging them in the phyllotax seed pattern that is present with the sunflower. However, I typically work in interior spaces, pinning seeds to the wall in wall installations. Do you have any tips for moving this concept outdoors?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I butchered some words there. I'm not familiar.
You did great. And the cool thing about the sunflower is that it's actually hundreds or even sometimes thousands of flowers inside of that flower. So what you think is one flower is many, many, many flowers. And it creates like this really cool spiral sort of in the center there. So right now you're doing that. I would think probably encasing it in some way, whether that's in like a resin or something, maybe. Is that something you've tried before? To maybe work on it on a piece of wood, and then create some resin around it. Something like that would maintain the integrity of the pattern in the material, in terms of being able to identify it, but then kind of make it so that it's not going to be damaged like it would be without that. Or maybe something where you have it between two pieces. I would really have to look at it. That sounds so interesting. I like that idea. I love the taking natural materials. I was talking to an artist the other day and I was like, oh, I can take you to our compost heap. Like, I think it's so fun to kind of dig around in that and see, the twigs, the branches, all of those pieces.
Thank you. Yeah, you should definitely look into Shalina's work. She will send you an email. So thank you for that response. Anyone else have any questions? This is so interesting. I love it. I really, I can't wait to see the proposals that you get after this chat.
I know. I'm excited / a little scared. Like I said, patience. We're just kind of getting things rolling and getting the conversation going back in the garden about having art out in the gardens, and we're planning our calendars and doing all of those fun things. And in that, we're trying to come up with some exhibitions. So we'll create some, but I would love to have some artists bring me something that they feel fits the space.
Yeah, and it's such a thriving community and such a really resilient community that I'm sure you're gonna get amazing things. Also, yeah. Juliet is asking, as far as illuminations go, is the WFC ever able to help provide technology or project, or does the artist secure all the tech?
So this year, the 2 projections, it was done as part of the collaboration with Steve Parker. And so it was 2 artists that he brought to the table, essentially. And so we kind of collaborated on it. The projectors, we had projectors by chance. And so I told him that we would figure out how to protect them from rain and things like that. And that was an interesting DIY project, but we did it. And then he provided the sound component because that's something that he has his mind wrapped around really well. And so he was able to provide the speaker sound component, and we provided the projection piece of it. So a lot of times it's kind of a collaboration. We had an artist who taught herself how to do the wiring kits for light bulbs as part of an installation that she had. So I would encourage you that if you feel like it's something that could become part of your art practice, to learn that skill, but we're also happy to kind of help facilitate that in whatever way we can.
Thank you. Oh, well, I'm so happy I got to see you and to hear more about the garden and all the projects. Like, it's just such an asset to have you around. I'm sure you'll get a bunch of good proposals, and thank you everyone for your patience and for being so engaged in this chat. Tomorrow we have Bailey Liu and Annette Carlotti at 11 a.m. for coffee chats. Make sure to join in. But yeah, like, lots of opportunities, and amazing that the center is so open to collaborate and to bringing great art into their space. So thank you so much for this talk. I love that I learned, and then I started just thinking on how to adapt all the things. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me, Coca, and thank you, as always, to Big Medium and Creative Standard for supporting the arts community in Austin.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, everybody. You have a lovely night.